Most men think the damage came from the betrayal itself, from the humiliation itself, from the moment they got overlooked, replaced, dismissed, and it's understandable to think that way because it keeps the pain outside you, where it feels cleaner, where it feels like a story about other people's flaws. But there's a quieter layer underneath that keeps returning until it's faced, because the deepest wounds usually aren't caused by what someone did. They're caused by what you allowed yourself to keep tolerating after you already knew what was happening. There's an unnamed way some men move through life, and it doesn't look like aggression, and it doesn't look like constant confrontation, and it definitely doesn't look like the loud alpha theater people perform online. It looks like something calmer and heavier than that. It looks like a man who is no longer surprised by patterns, no longer seduced by potential, no longer hypnotized by apologies that don't change behavior. A man who can feel the first tremor of disrespect and doesn't need a second one to confirm it, because his standards are not based on how much he can endure. They're based on what he's no longer willing to pay for. And the curiosity starts here, because most men don't realize the first betrayal is rarely external, it's internal, it's subtle, it's the moment the body knows and the mouth says it's fine. It's the moment the mind sees the red flag and still chooses the comfort of staying. It's the moment the soul tightens and the ego tries to smooth it over. And once that internal pattern exists, the outside world doesn't need to hurt you aggressively. It only needs to test you lightly, because a man who negotiates with himself will eventually be negotiated with by others. The separation happens quietly, and it isn't moral. It isn't good men versus bad men. It's reactors versus governed men, and reactors don't even know they're reactors because they call their reactions being nice, being patient, being understanding, being mature. And sometimes it really is those things, but sometimes it's something else hiding under a clean label. Sometimes it's fear of conflict, fear of being alone, fear of being misunderstood, fear of losing what's familiar, because familiar pain feels safer than unfamiliar silence. And a man will choose familiar pain over unfamiliar silence more often than he wants to admit. Governed men don't look tougher at first. They just look slower to surrender their inner space. They look like they have a gate, and the gate is what changes everything. Because the world doesn't respect speeches, it respects patterns, and patterns begin with what you allow repeatedly, not once, not in a crisis moment, but in the ordinary moments where you let a tone slide, a boundary blur, a small disrespect land without consequence because the mind thinks it's not worth it, and sometimes it isn't worth it. But often what's happening isn't wisdom, it's avoidance. And avoidance always sends a message even when you don't realize you're sending it. That's the part people don't talk about, that every time you swallow something you shouldn't have swallowed, you sign a small psychological contract with yourself that says, "This is who I am." And the mind clings to that contract like identity, because identity is the deepest addiction. And a man will defend the version of himself he knows, even when that version is ruining his life, simply because it's familiar, because it fits the story he's been living inside for years. The story where he's the one who gives chances, the one who stays calm, the one who keeps the peace, the one who is bigger, and then the story keeps producing the same outcome, the same bleeding, the same resentment, the same late-night bitterness that isn't even aimed at the other person anymore. It's aimed inward because the man knows, in the quietest place inside, that he didn't have to stay. This is where Stoicism stops being quotes and becomes a blade. Because Stoicism is not softness. It's not passive acceptance of disrespect. It's not pretending everything is fine. It's the discipline of separating what is within your control from what is not. And the most overlooked part is that your boundaries are within your control. Your standards are within your control. Your presence is within your control. Your availability is within your control. And yet so many men live as if those things are negotiable based on mood, based on guilt, based on how much someone needs them, based on how afraid they are to be seen as cold. And that's why the same cycle repeats, because a man who can be guilted is a man who can be steered. The mirror is brutal because it isn't accusing, it's just revealing. And what it reveals is usually not that the world is filled with monsters, but that the world is filled with incentives, and incentives are efficient. And a man who makes himself easy to cross will be crossed, Not always out of malice, often out of convenience, because people do what they can get away with. And the first get away with it happens in the small moments, the small tests, the casual disrespect, the slightly late reply that becomes normal, the little lie that gets forgiven, the boundary pushed half an inch and half an inch again, until suddenly you wake up living in a world where you are treated like an option, and you tell yourself it happened overnight, but your body remembers every early warning it gave you. This is why the idea of killing who you were resonates, because it's not actually about cruelty, it's about endings. And endings are what reactive men avoid, because endings force grief, and grief forces silence. And silence forces the mind to feel what it has been avoiding. And most men don't fear pain as much as they fear the moment of stillness, where they can no longer distract themselves from what they already know. So when a man says he needs a funeral, the deeper truth is that he needs to stop feeding the old identity, because identity is fed by repetition, and repetition is fed by permission, and permission is fed by hesitation, and hesitation is the real enemy. Not hesitation in the "I'm thinking carefully" way, but hesitation in the "I know what this is and I'm afraid to act" way. Because that hesitation becomes a lifestyle, it becomes the habit of delaying the line, delaying the decision, delaying the exit, delaying the truth until the truth arrives anyway. But now it arrives with damage. And here is where curiosity deepens, because a lot of men assume that if they just become harsher, everything will change. But harshness is just another reaction, and reaction is still weakness, because reaction means the world sets your pace, and the governed man doesn't become harsh. He becomes precise, and precision is quiet. It doesn't rage, it doesn't threaten, it doesn't announce. It simply stops participating in what doesn't deserve participation. The hunter mentality is misunderstood because people think it means aggression, but real hunters are defined by restraint, because restraint is what keeps the shot clean. Restraint is what keeps timing intact. Restraint is what stops waste, and in life, waste is where most men die slowly, not physically, but internally. The death of respect, the death of ambition, the death of clarity, because they keep donating energy to people and situations that return nothing but the same lesson. This is why silence becomes important, not as a tactic to dominate, but as a natural consequence of self-respect. Because the old version of a man talks too much, he explains too much, he confesses too much, he tries to be understood by people who have already decided their angle. He tries to talk his way out of what should be solved by a boundary, and every time he explains, he gives away a map. And maps make you predictable, and predictable men are easy to manage. A sovereign mind begins to feel like this. The world starts pulling the old levers and they don't land. Guilt doesn't hook you the way it used to. Urgency doesn't rush you the way it used to. Someone's disappointment doesn't collapse you. Someone's praise doesn't intoxicate you. And at first this feels strange because you were trained to be emotionally available in a way that is actually emotional extractable. Meaning people can take from you by making you feel bad, by making you feel responsible, by making you feel like you owe them an explanation. And once you see that mechanism clearly, the old version of you starts looking less like kindness and more like leakage. And this is where something like psycho-cybernetics lands in a different way, because the mind follows the self-image the way a machine follows its target, and a man's life keeps returning to the identity he believes is him, even if he hates the results, because the subconscious will defend the familiar self more than it will defend your conscious dreams. And that is why men read wisdom, feel inspired for a day, and then return to the same tolerances, the same apologies, the same over-explaining. Because inspiration doesn't overwrite identity, only repeated proof does. Repeated proof that the man you are becoming is real. Repeated proof that you can feel discomfort and not negotiate. Repeated proof that you can be misunderstood and not fold. So the real funeral isn't a speech, it's a sequence of small moments where you refuse to keep the old version alive, where you stop replying instantly just to prove loyalty, where you stop staying in conversations that drain your dignity, where you stop letting nostalgia act like a valid reason to return to disrespect, where you stop forgiving patterns and start recognizing them, because forgiving patterns isn't mercy, it's self-harm in a polite suit. And the deepest curiosity point is this. What if the thing you call softness isn't actually softness? What if it's the addiction to being seen as good? Because good becomes a currency men use when they don't trust their own power. And when a man relies on being seen as good, he becomes dependent on other people's approval to feel stable. And dependency is always expensive because it means your peace is rented, not owned. A governed man doesn't need to be seen as good. He needs to be true. He needs to be consistent. He needs to be aligned. And alignment often looks harsh to people who benefited from your misalignment because they were comfortable when you were easy to manipulate and uncomfortable when you become hard to steer. And this is why the transition feels lonely for many men. Not because power is sad, but because the old social contracts were built around you being available, explainable, pliable, and when that changes, the environment reacts, because environments always react when someone stops playing their assigned role. This is the part most people aren't prepared for, because they think transformation comes with applause. But it comes with misunderstanding first. It comes with people calling you cold, distant, arrogant, changed. And those are just labels thrown at a man when access is reduced, because people rarely complain when they still benefit. But the end of the story isn't isolation, it's gravity. Because when a man stops leaking emotion, he starts carrying presence. And presence doesn't require constant words, it doesn't require constant proof. It simply exists, and it makes people adjust their tone without knowing why. It makes them think twice before wasting your time. It makes them recognize boundaries without you having to explain them, because consistent boundaries become reality, and reality doesn't argue. Discipline in this world isn't hype, it's lifestyle. It's boredom handled well. It's doing the same clean thing repeatedly until the nervous system learns that chaos is not required for life to feel meaningful. It's the quiet practice of holding shape under pressure. And once that becomes your identity, the old version doesn't just die, it becomes irrelevant because you stop feeding it, and what isn't fed cannot run your life. And the ending is always quiet, because once you cross a certain line internally, it becomes hard to go back without feeling the cost. It becomes hard to tolerate what you used to tolerate, not because you became cruel, but because you became honest, and honesty makes certain rooms feel too small. Certain conversations feel too cheap. Certain people feel too predictable, and some paths close quietly behind you without a fight. If this hit in a clean way, comment, Hunter. Hit like if it feels like you. And if you want more of this calm, stoic, hunter-minded framing, self-command without performance, discipline without noise, subscribe, because the noise doesn't stop, and some men quietly stop letting it touch their decisions.